And welcome on in, everybody, to the Check Your Brain podcast hosted by me, Tony Mazur. If you are on YouTube and Rumble, well, you get to see me. Hi, everybody. You see our little boxes in the corner. That is my podcast logo. I do have a free podcast that goes out every week wherever you get your podcast, which is this one. But if you want more content from me, to go to patreon.com/Tony Mazur, TonyMazur. For just $3 a month, you get content where I rant on solo shows and I have guests on, and sometimes I give you bonus content if you give me a couple extra bucks a month. But if you don't feel like being shaken down and hustled by me for more money, the free podcast is out. And I also do another Rumble show where I do kind of what I do on Patreon, but I put that out for you folks for free, usually on Thursday. So go check that out. But yeah, this is the free podcast where I have a lot of guests on. And what this guest really has kind of been a bit of a renaissance woman and is surfaced in a couple of arenas. In fact, no pun intended, but one of them a literal arena. And that is my guest today, Jennifer Say. Thank you for doing this, by the way.
Yeah, happy to be here. Nice to meet you.
So you are, for people who heard about your name before, they're like, wait a second, why have I heard this person's name a couple of different times? Because usually when you're a young you see a lot of gymnasts or Olympians, and they kind of make a lot of appearances. They'll be on some Wheaties boxes and everything. But you were a young gymnast, and then eventually you rose up the ranks in corporate America. So you've been in the public eye for, gosh, since the 80s. I don't mean to age you, but I mean that's you've been around that long. People could find the record. So for folks who aren't aware of who you are, I guess give a little bit of the backstory from you being the gymnast to working your way up into corporate America.
Yeah, I was an elite gymnast as a child. I never made a Wheaties box, but I made the national team for about 7, 8 years, I think. It's hard to count. First time being, I think, 1981, aging myself. I went to world championships and I was the national champion in 1986. So, and I ended up retiring or walking away from the sport just a month before the Olympic trials in 1988, which is kind of part of, because I think as a gymnast, I'm less known for my gymnastics. It's been said I was the worst national champion that ever existed. That may be true. It doesn't really matter. But more known for much later in 2008, having spoken out about the abuses, the physical, sexual, emotional abuse in gymnastics. I wrote a memoir, my first book called Chalked Up, which came out in 2008. And I was, I was close to 40 at the time the book came out. So obviously not a gymnast anymore and hadn't competed in many, many years and was already a vice president in corporate America at Levi's, where I worked at the time. So I had moved on. I had 2 kids. I was married. But I felt compelled to write this book because, 20 or so years out of competing, I was still really struggling with the treatment that we, labored under as young athletes. Gymnasts are very young. Like I said, I made my first national team when I was like 11. I was just a baby, really. I was training 5, 6 hours a day already. And the coaching is really cruel. It's an incredibly cruel coaching culture. It's brutal. Outside of the sexual abuse, which is, I think, now kind of understood because of the case of Larry Nassar, which I can mention later. But the physical and emotional abuse is absolutely brutal. I mean, everything from, I was weighed in, my weight was announced on the loudspeaker at the gym. I was shamed and fat shamed for, having 1% body fat and weighing 98 pounds when I was 18, not just in the gym by my coaches, but by like the nutritionist hired by Team USA. I mean, this is how bad it was. Forced to train on very serious injuries, competed and trained on a broken ankle for 2 years at the end of my career. Eating disorders are rampant. We were often told you need to lose 3 pounds by tomorrow by any means necessary. What does that mean to a 13-year-old? That means I'm going to go home and do something that's not very good for me. So, and that's the abuses around, training on injuries and the fat shaming, but just the general treatment, you're a lazy piece of garbage, you're a piece of shit. Like all this shit was just, was just sort of normal.
Yeah,
it was normal and par for the course. And you were kind of made to feel like, well, if this bothers me, if I am upset by this, if I feel wounded because of this treatment, then I am weak. And so I better just keep my mouth shut and keep going. But of course, it affects you and your self-esteem. And so all of that is to say, by the time I was 40, I still was sort of dealing with some of the repercussions of this. And despite success in gymnastics as well as in the corporate world, I had cripplingly low self-esteem and terrible anxiety, and I still had like PTSD nightmares about gymnastics. And so I wrote the book because I was just trying to kind of make sense of it. I wrote the book, and I went to a lot of therapy, and I came to understand that essentially it's like being an abused child, right? Like if a mother hits her kid, she usually will say something to the effect of, well, I wouldn't have to hit you if you weren't so bad. So it's your fault you were abused. And that's kind of what I believed about myself. I got over that in the last 10 years. But so I'm more known for that because it was the first person account of what it was like in the sport. There had been one journalistic account before that, but that was it.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because you're dealing with very young, vulnerable women at that time who are trying to compete. I saw the quote there from Dominique Mosiano, who, by the way, is from my neck of the woods here in Cleveland,
Oh,
Ohio.
nice. She's a friend.
She was one of my first crushes, and I got to meet her, and I'm like, okay, yeah, that's remember when I was a kid, you were a kid, and now
She's
everyone's
great.
married, and
Yeah.
but it was like one of those really cool things. But what I find interesting is that you're dealing with the vulnerability of kids. You essentially are children and trying to compete at such a high level. And I think also part of that too, that I know you've chronicled a little bit, is that uncertainty, and that there are certain sports where you move on to bigger and better things. So if you're a high school football player, you're the starting quarterback, you know that you'll get a scholarship to college. Well, then you get scholarship to college, you're the starting quarterback at insert major university, and it's leading to something. But think about a professional wrestler, for example. Okay, yeah, he's a wrestler in high school, but usually most people are not going to go into the WWE or all these other leagues. That when you get done playing, you're wrestling in high school and college, that's about it. And you have to figure out, you have to pivot. And your pivoting in this case is really fascinating because, I know Dominique does a lot of personal appearances, and I know other young Olympians were doing this, especially gymnasts and everything. But eventually your body catches up to you, and you can't do that when you're 45, 50, 60 years old doing back handsprings and pommel horse and everything like that. So eventually you have to pivot, which you did. And it's fascinating how you, like I said earlier, you resurfaced and really made a name for yourself.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, one of the things I wrote about in my first book, and possibly in my second, I can't even remember what I said at this point. I went to college and it felt like retirement. Like I was exhausted. I'd already had a career for 15 years. I was 20 years old. I went a little late, and I had no gymnastics career ahead of me. I lived in a dorm with a bunch of guys who were playing football and baseball and tennis in college, and they went on to become professionals. So I was as good as they were at my sport, but there was no future for me. And unless you're Simone Biles, which no one is in the whole world, you don't make money, even if you went to the Olympics. I mean, I know so many Olympians from the last 20 or 30 years. A scant few are making any money from the sport. You go on and you have a regular life, and you get a job, and you do normal stuff. So I never had any intentions of staying connected to the sport. I didn't want to be a coach. Dominique does own a gym. And arguably was much more famous than me. She was a gold medalist in 1996. So I didn't want to own a gym. I didn't want to be a judge. I didn't want to do any of that. I just wanted to put it all behind me. It didn't end all that well. I felt sort of ashamed. In fact, now I feel quite proud of what I achieved. So I just figured I'll go to college and get a job like a normal person and work my way up whatever ladder I find. So, that's what I did. I officially became like a normal person, aggressively so, I would argue, in college, because I really wanted to kind of find an identity in the world that was not as a gymnast, as a good little girl, obedient gymnast, because that's what we were.
Really trying to go and separate yourself from this is Jennifer Say the gymnast and Jennifer Say the career woman, businesswoman, or student, or whatever the case is, that you, like you said, you lived a different life and now you want to start a new path.
Yeah. And I mean, honestly, I completely walked away from the sport. I didn't do it in college until I wrote the book 20 years later. I had nothing to do with the sport. I hadn't been to a gymnastics meet. I didn't really have friends from the sport. I just sort of was like a regular person. And I went to college, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was pretty confused because I was still depressed and like had all this, garbage that I was dealing with from gymnastics, and mostly I wanted to rest. But I got through college and then graduated, and it was the recession, and I was, I needed a job, and I took a job in an advertising agency, not really wanting to work in corporate America. That had never been my dream. I thought I'd do something in a creative field, but I ended up liking it, and I was good at it. And there was some creativity to it at an ad agency. It was just sort of intersecting with commerce. And eventually, maybe 6-7 years later, I found myself at Levi's as a marketing assistant there, and I stayed 23 years.
So you grew up in New Jersey, and here you are at Stanford. You go all the way across the country, and you're working for a large Bay Area name in Levi Strauss. That's incredible, going from, again, an East Coaster and then you spend, almost 35 years on the West Coast. And was that a bit of a culture shock for you?
Oh my gosh, no, I loved it. I moved around a lot as a kid because I went to different gyms. So I didn't have any real connection. I mean, it was always in South Jersey, Philadelphia, ended up in Allentown. I went to 3 different high schools though. So you can imagine, if you go to 3 different high schools, you don't feel totally connected to that community.
Yeah.
And when I got to Stanford in the Bay Area, it was like, oh my gosh, I'm home. Like, this is amazing. And I made the best friends of my life. And then I moved to the city after I finished college, and it was 1992. And I never had lived in a place that felt like home, which is, I left there a couple of years ago. I find it very sad what's happened to that city. We can talk about that.
Mhm.
But I always tell people, if you ever felt like a weirdo, if you ever felt like you didn't fit in, San Francisco was the place for you. It was just filled with weirdos.
San Francisco was the keep San Francisco weird type of people.
Yeah, it had the Austin, right. It's not that anymore. In fact, I've often said it's the home of such aggressive conformity at this point that it became unlivable for me, and I left 2.5 years ago. But I loved it, loved it, loved it. Tech took over. This sort of fake altruism took over, and it just became very uniform and conformist, and it was no longer for me. But that took a good 30 years.
Mm-hmm. Well, and what's interesting, because reading your book and reading what and listening to you on other podcasts and interviews, you've talked about how with being with Levi and resurrecting that brand. And here, I think a lot of people were kind of confused by that, because when you think of jeans, when you think of the whole clothing, there was a Levi outlet we would always go to, and Levi stores, and you think of it's Levi's and almost everyone else. Brett Favre has Wrangler jeans and everything, and with the George Thorogood music and throwing a football around the backyard. But for the most part, it was like, okay, yeah, that's Wrangler, but I'm getting my Levi's. I have to get this. And it was a recognizable brand. It was a legacy brand, but I didn't realize that it had gone through so many problems, and that you really helped resurrect it and put them back on the map again.
Yeah, no, that's a good description. Obviously, this is a brand that's been around 150 years, a company that's been around 170. It started as a dry goods store, actually, not a jeans brand. 20 years later, patent for the first blue jean, 1873. And throughout the 80s and 90s, it just took off. It just soared. It went international. In the 80s, it was like the coolest jean you could imagine. There was this campaign called 501 Blues, which launched at the 84 Olympics. I was just a kid at the time, but there was nothing cooler than a pair of Levi's jeans. And the market was really different than it is now. I mean, now you have thousands of choices of jeans to wear. At the time, you had 3 big players. You had Levi's, Wrangler, and Lee, and that was kind of it. And I think Levi's was such a dominant force. This is well documented in many sort of Harvard Business School reviews. They became a little complacent over the course of 20 years and really lost their footing by about 2000, and suffered a slow and steady decline of about a decade, a little more. From there until in 2011, it was like, are we going to make it? Almost bankrupt in 2011. But starting in 2013, I stepped into the CMO role, which is the chief marketing officer. And I don't want to say it was all me. See your cute cat there.
Yeah, it's hard.
But there was a new leadership team, a new CEO, and the mission was to get Levi's back to its leadership position, and we did that. And in 2019, had a very successful IPO. It was privately owned before that.
Yeah, it's amazing, because I was watching something on Kodak, And you think, go back 20 years ago and you say Kodak, could you think of a brand that's more synonymous, well, other than maybe Kleenex or chapstick, where
with
when
a
you take a
camera.
picture, you're taking a Kodak? It's a Kodak moment. And to think
Yeah,
that they would have gone bankrupt. And I think Levi's was the same way, that
that's right.
like you said, that it really seemed like they got complacent. You had other companies, not only companies like Guess Jeans would come up, and they'd have the spokesmodels, the Claudia Schiffers of the world that were on there. But when Walmart, when Target have their own brands, they're like, we can make jeans too, and we'll make them for much cheaper than you get for Levi. That it is an interesting point how a brand could slip into. I mean, or
Yeah,
you could go to a
decline.
store like a Kmart or a Sears that, again, 30 years ago, say, there will be a time when there's 3 Kmarts left. And you're like, come on, are you kidding me?
Right,
But legacy
right.
brands do get complacent.
Yeah, and they fail to innovate for the future and, evolve their message for a modern audience. And you just described, I mean, we were getting it from all sides. You had these sort of super premium brands. It started with CK, Calvin Klein, and maybe the 90s, but ended with Seven Jeans and then Rag and Bone. And then you had all these people paying $200+ for a pair of jeans. But then you
Tommy
had the
Hilfiger was around.
yeah, and then you had the private label, which is what we call it, which is what you described, where you have, Target making their own brand of jeans, and those are sort of undercutting you on price. And then you had a whole like cadre of brands that were just like coming out of hip hop culture, which those
or
have sort
or
of died.
Abercrombie, Hollister, Aeropostale, those brands as well.
You have all those, yeah, which are mid-market, but became really, really relevant and sold in their own stores, whereas Levi's was selling in wholesale, and that became sort of dated and irrelevant. So all of a sudden, you're like one of three players in town, and now you're one of 1,000. You need to have a different kind of competitive mindset, and we sort of lost that, but we got it back, and I think rebuilt the brand, and it became really, really cool and popular again.
So for all this time and getting back into Levi's, and it's leading me, of course, to your book, because for that time that you were there, even you putting out the book in 2008 about the atrocities happening in the gymnastics world, you weren't making waves as far as like negative. It's like, oh no, that's what Jennifer, she's a brand manager. Eventually you became brand manager, and you were a part of this and resurrecting the brand. And like you said, there is a lot of uniform conformity that goes on in these kind of echo chambers across the country, especially in San Francisco. And you weren't really making any, negative issues until that certain time around March of 2020, which you chronicle in your book, which came out, gosh, actually about a year ago right now.
Yeah.
And it's still selling. People are very interested in this topic. And that book, by the way, for folks listening, is Levi's Unbuttoned: The Woke Mob Took My Job But Gave Me My Voice, by Jennifer Say. It's out. It's on Amazon. And it talk about how you went from being somebody that's a well-respected coworker to you finally said something, and those coworkers who would treat you so well in the hallways, and you'd have coffee, to have lunch dates, dinner dates, maybe see each other on the weekends, whatever, they turned their backs on you really quickly because you said very logical things in a very illogical time.
Yeah, it wasn't a logical time. And to your point, I mean, I'd always been known as someone outspoken about my beliefs. And, you look back on what I said about gymnastics, because I did talk about the sexual abuse, and you think, well, that wasn't controversial. I will tell you, I have some experience getting canceled. Like this was with COVID was my second rodeo. That in 2008, to say that the national team coach throughout the 80s was a rapist, that was controversial. Not to
Mm-hmm.
the people I worked with, but in the Olympic movement. And I was, oh my God, I was called every name you can imagine, on social media, but in real life too. I mean, ex-teammates called into radio stations to call me a liar and a grifter and all this stuff. So that whole sort of cancellation thing was happening. Now, I experienced that. I was redeemed in about 2018 when Larry Nassar, the doctor for Team USA for 30 years, who sexually abused over 500 athletes, went to prison for life. Everybody said, oh, Jen was right. We stood by her always.
Of course.
Yeah, of course, they misremember history. So my point is, I was known as someone outspoken, if not controversial. I was not, my politics very much aligned with the city, because I think it's important to note it was the entire city of San Francisco that came for me. And eventually, as I became more known in my resisting lockdowns, the country, there were the Covidians, as we call them, online, who just literally, came for me. So this wasn't just about the workplace, but yeah, I was very outspoken about lockdowns and school closures in particular. Mostly I focused on restrictions to children. And, it's very related to what I described earlier in gymnastics, because I felt like kids aren't going to speak up for themselves if they are hurting and they are suffering. Kids try to please the adults around them.
Kids are resilient, remember?
I know. Kids. And so, I kept thinking, I wish someone had stood up for me when it was clear that bad things were happening in the gym. I wish some adult had the courage to say, this is not normal, but they didn't. And so I went, I was redeemed in the gymnastics world. And in 2020, I made a movie called Athlete A, which did really well, and it won an Emmy. It's a documentary about the Larry Nassar case and the broader abuses. And everybody liked me again, except then they found out I was a COVID dissenter and they came for me. The gymnastics community really, really came for me in 2020. And I was outspoken from day one, even before the schools shut down. And I was very measured. There's a lot of the tweets in my book. I wrote op-eds. There's some edits, some clips from those. I was very measured. I'm very diplomatic. I try to, I'm not a name caller. I'm not a yeller. I had the chance to kind of go back over my tweet history as I wrote the book. And I was like, I don't regret anything I said or how I said it.
Mm-hmm.
I conducted myself. I was composed. I was respectful. I cited facts. It didn't matter. I was called a racist and a eugenicist and a ableist and a Nazi.
Grandma killer, all the, yeah.
Yeah, I was a Nazi. That was the good one. I'm now called a Christo-fascist a lot, which I had to look up what that was.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because I believe your husband also was pretty, was shooting from the hip a little bit.
My husband is more aggressive than I am in tone in real life and online. People used to say to me, oh, but your husband, that's just probably like his online, persona, because it's very aggressive. And I'm like, no, that's what he's like in real life. So he was a little more assertive. I was very cognizant of my role in the company and wanted to always be very respectful. And I also was very cognizant of not commenting on policies we had in the company. That was part of the reason I stuck with children, because kids don't work in the company. So that was not commenting on a company policy. And at first, in the first, 6 months, no one noticed. I didn't, I had like 10 followers or something, maybe 1,000, not very many. But then, those of us who were pushing back on COVID rules, there weren't that many of us. We found each other fast. We followed each other. So I built a little bit of a following. And then eventually I was like on the local news and started having rallies to get schools open. And people started noticing. And that's when people in the community in San Francisco started basically saying I should be fired.
Of course. Well, it's what's interesting is so I didn't get a chance to off air tell you more about my background. Is I was a radio guy at the time. I work a normal job now where I get paid a lot more money. I have a lot more freedom to podcast and talk about things, but I was a radio guy that I was a producer and fill-in host at the time. And I was working my way. I was trying to get to, whatever, potentially host a radio show. I was 2020 was the year I got married. And so I've got all this stuff going on for me. And I remember I went out to California. I was out of I worked a part-time job too. So I took time off for my, I actually had vacation time saved up so I can work another job and make a couple extra bucks on the side, which is I worked for a promotions company and we went out to California. We're in LA, we're in San Diego, March 8th of 2020, which was a Sunday. And I remembered we started hearing about COVID for the first couple of weeks, don't touch your face, wash your hands. And then a couple of days later, I'm walking into what was then known as the Staples Center in Los Angeles. And I get the word that it says Tom Hanks has coronavirus.
Oh, right. I remember
and then they shut the NBA down. And then the NHL, which I was going to an NHL game, that was shut down. They shut down spring training. And I'm from Ohio, which was the first state to start locking people down. They had the Arnold exposition, the Arnold Schwarzenegger weightlifting bodybuilding competition. And then the governor of Ohio, Mike DeWine, shut the schools down. And so by the time I came back from California, the world was over. It was done. Yeah. Everything was changed.
Yeah.
So I was going to work, and I basically got censored by my radio station from hosting because I, quote unquote, didn't
Right.
take the coronavirus serious. Because
Seriously.
and when I say that is I was talking about things like, what are the repercussions here? What
Right.
are the repercussions that we could be dealing with? And one of them I had mentioned was about, what about like all these music venues or a comedy show or something? And they
Right.
said, and the response was, Tony is selfish because he wants
Yeah.
to go to a concert. And I
Yeah.
said, no, what I'm being selfish about is I'm thinking of the local venue that books
Yep.
the people, takes the tickets, the security, the roadies, the lighting guys, the sound guys,
The
this,
cleaners, the food vendors,
all
the
of it.
people. Yeah. Yeah,
And
me
it
too.
bothered me so much at the beginning, on top of, because I'm looking at all the other people who do gig work, and nobody was covering it in mainstream media, including my radio station at the time. It was all about, oh, well, we got to watch out. This could be killer. This could be deadly. And I'm like, yes, but look at your cost benefit analysis right now. Look at
There
your
was
risk
none.
assessment. And I'm like, I don't think this is going to work out. And I essentially got censored. It was very close to getting fired from that job. Eventually, I lost my job a couple of years later, different story. But the target was on my back at that time.
Yeah.
And I was getting people sending screenshots of my tweets where I was saying, like, what about all the people who are in Alcoholics Anonymous that got shut
Yeah.
down? What about the
Oh
people
yeah.
who were saved through going to synagogue, going to church, going to whatever, some place of
Yeah.
worship? All those got shut down, but the liquor stores are still open. The
The
grocery
weed
stores
shops.
and the fast food places still open. And I'm just like, am I the only person who's concerned about this? And apparently I
It felt
wasn't.
it felt like we were though. It did feel like we were, and I feel like my husband and I in San Francisco were definitely the only ones. Um, there was no one, and it was difficult, as I'm sure you experienced. And
Mm-hmm.
it was easy to be like, am I missing something? But the more I read and I educated myself, and one of the reasons I got very involved on Twitter at the time is one of the cool things about Twitter, which is different than other social media, is you can really like I would reach out to doctors and ask them questions, and I would say, I asked them, because I wanted to understand. You could talk directly with experts and they would answer you. And so I educated myself, and everything I learned just reinforced what I already understood to be true, which is like, what's the phrase about now I'm going to forget it, but it was like you had this IFR, which they were saying infection fatality rate was like well over 3%, but it was well under 1%. Kids
Yep.
were not really at any risk, yet they were the most restricted. We opened bars first, strip clubs in San Francisco, and my son still couldn't go to high school English class or have a preschool graduation or any of it. It just didn't make sense. The kids bore the heaviest burden and were least at risk. And to me, that's not how it should ever go. But there was no thinking straight. And the more left-leaning a place you lived in, the more intense it was. San Francisco had the longest lockdowns of any city in America, suffered the greatest economic impacts, have more people leaving that city than any other city in the country. 7% of the people left in 2020 and 21. That's a huge number, 7%.
Yeah.
So the city is really, really suffering and have had the slowest economic recovery. Their downtown is dead. I was one of the people that left in 2021 because there was no sign. I left in February 21. There was no sign they were going to open the schools that fall. They were threatening not to. And I was like, I got to get the hell out of here. This is not okay for my kids. It's not okay for me and for my mental health. And it doesn't even make any sense. So, but you could not even ask a very polite question. What about the small business owners? You couldn't do that without being called a murderer.
Yeah, you were going to kill grandma because you wanted businesses to open, and it turned into you just want to get a haircut or you want a meal at Chili's. And it wasn't the case. And like you said left leaning. And even to this day, I still see it I'm in a red state, but I'm in a blue area, and I still see masks. I mean, it is November of 2023 that we're talking.
Yeah.
And it almost seems like it's a true sign of a virtue that they're signaling to people. But it was weird how at the beginning it was political, because it shouldn't be political. If we're concerned, this is what in my opinion, and I think the facts kind of back up the opinion, is it shouldn't be political. if we knew pretty early on, and when I say early on, I'm saying April of
Oh
2020,
yeah,
that this disease is affecting older
old
people
people.
and immunocompromised or obese or all the above. Immunocompromised, obese, old people are probably, forget about it. I mean, the case fatality rate was skyrocketing. Yet we quarantined healthy young people. And in turn, they ended up gaining a lot more weight, especially kids. Kids couldn't
Yeah,
see their friends, couldn't do any. Kids couldn't have a homecoming, or I should say a prom. They couldn't finish their senior
graduation, football
seasons and
games, nothing.
graduations. It was
Yeah,
amazing. And again, if you're in a blue area, you start looking around going, am I the bad guy? Am I
right.
I'm doing the research. I'm trying to figure this out. And yet here are my friends that say, hey, let's do Zoom happy hour at 5 o'clock. I'm like, no,
No,
we're in our
I
early 30s. We're healthy enough to have our own happy hour.
I refused. I had to at work. We were, working virtually for gosh, more than 2 years. So I had to participate in the Zoom culture then, but I refused any and all Zoom happy hours, Zoom Thanksgivings. I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. And let me just say, you're correct. This is primarily a virus that adversely impacts the elderly. You named a couple other groups. Even those two other groups, far, far, far behind the elderly in terms of the impact, and like there's so many autoimmune diseases out there. I have one. I am not at extra risk. Like I hate lumping in the immune deficient because then everybody raises their hand. Something like 35% of women have an autoimmune disease.
Yeah.
No, you're actually fine. Immune deficient, if you've had an organ transplant, yes, you're at risk, but not if you have psoriatic arthritis. You're not. You're fine. You're just like everybody else. Yes, those who are severely overweight, but children are mercifully protected, and we just never, we never looked that reality in the face and let kids have their lives back. And what kids have suffered now in terms of the learning loss, the ongoing mental health impacts, the weight gain, the chronic absenteeism that's happening now in schools, the dropout rate, which nobody talks about, but is going to continue. Because if you fell behind freshman year and you haven't caught up yet, the likelihood of you dropping out is high. And what drove me crazy, to your point, is like you just got accused of like wanting a haircut. No, I don't want a haircut, but I don't care. I don't really get one anyway. But like when my son couldn't have a preschool graduation outside, yeah, I cared about that. These are tiny little milestones, but milestones are what make a life. And you keep telling these kids that they don't matter enough to have these little milestones, whether it's prom or graduation or preschool graduation, and you give them no hope for when this will end. And so the suicide rate and the drug addiction and overdose rate for young people, because remember when you're a kid, like everything is right now. And if you have no hope that you're going to get to go to prom next year, for far too many kids who, yeah, probably leaned towards depression before, but would have been fine, it just became too hopeless to continue.
Yeah, when you had mentioned about in the book and talking about how kids are resilient, it's like kids may be resilient in some ways, but their prefrontal cortex is not developed yet, that they don't understand that these memories that they were robbed of. I mean, you'll never get this time back in your life. Thinking about the senior class of 20, this is one thing that really bothered me. You probably saw this from your Facebook friends too. It was the senior class and schools were shut down. Everyone's either doing Zoom school or we're just extended spring break. Do whatever you want, play video games, watch Marvel movies, watch Tiger King. And I saw this tone deaf thing on Facebook where everybody started posting their high school class photo. And they're like, here's me in the class of 86. Here's me in the class of 72. Here's me in the class of 2005. Boy, what kind of hair. And I'm like, do you understand how tone deaf it is that
right.
what you're doing is you're bragging to these seniors, whether you think you are or not, and spitting in their face by saying, I got to have a senior year. I went to homecoming. I was on the homecoming court. My prom was great. Too bad you can't have it. And I'm thinking, again, am I the only one who doesn't see the problem here?
Well, you were one of not too many in the beginning that was willing to speak out. And I'll tell you, I get why they weren't willing if other people saw it, because it did stink. Look, I ended up giving everything up in my life, almost everything, not everything, because I felt so strongly about protecting children. And as the name calling and the reputational harm started to come in an attempt to silence me, I felt really, really strongly that I really needed to keep speaking up, because there was so much actual censorship, as we know now from the Twitter files, but social censorship as well. And the fact is I was right. I was right about all of it. Every little bit of it. And, one of the things I find funny is now most of the friends that I have are canceled people. And so many, a lot of them for things like what I spoke up about, some of them, they actually did things that I'm like, whoa, that's pretty bad. I was right about all of it. And there's still no redemption at the end of the line. If you were a COVID dissident, not yet anyway. I think at some point there may be, but certainly not yet. It was just like, you couldn't say it. And as we said, the deeper the city, the deeper the blue the state or city, the worse it was and the more conformist it was. And so, my husband and I were sort of out there almost alone on a limb. We found a couple, literally a couple people in San Francisco who were willing to kind of stand up with us, but not very many. It really was kind of risking everything to do so, which I didn't think about that when I started, but then when I kind of got the pushback, I was like, hell no, I'm saying true things. I get to say these things.
Yeah,
I get to say these things.
People wanted to shame you for saying things that went against, because they're like, because that was one of the problems that I noticed, was this rise of the expert class. That we had Dr. Fauci, you had Rochelle Walensky, you had Francis Collins, and therefore, instead of having the old Crossfire, the CNN show Crossfire, where you can have Paul Begala on one side and Pat Buchanan on the other, and then they argue for a half hour, and then they kind of come to some kind of like, okay, well, where's a happy medium here? The expert class made it so that if you didn't agree with the expert, your opinions are now outside the Overton window of public and acceptable discourse. And that's what was wrong, because it's like when Dr. Fauci literally said, I am the science. And if you are disagreeing with me, you're anti-science. So therefore, he props himself up as if you have any issue with him, it's because you have an issue with everybody else who believes in this, what seemed like it was either cult or religion. And a lot of people bought into it and felt that if you said anything that Dr. Fauci wasn't saying, then you're Hitler, essentially. And I hate using Godwin's law with talking about it, but that's what they were saying. That,
seems
like you
appropriate
said, that people
right
called you
now.
Nazis. It was unbelievable how, and this wasn't just 2020. This wasn't just election. This wasn't anything like that. It goes into 2021 when now we have the vaccine mandates.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it kept getting worse. And I avoided talking about vaccine mandates for the most part because my company had one. But I still get horrible DMs and I still do. It's like, I believe it's established beyond a shadow of a doubt that closed schools were a terrible mistake and incredibly harmful. And yet, I'm still getting, you're a disgusting eugenicist and you don't care if Black children die. That was basically the gist of it. So, there were some people so convinced that they will never move away from that perspective. But, you mentioned earlier how politicized it came. And as somebody who is now accused of being alt-right, not accused, but, stated to be alt-right, despite having spent my entire life, left of center, they would shout at us that we were politicizing it. I still get that. You politicized mask wearing. No, I didn't. I am not the one. And the fact is, and I thought this early on in 2020, I didn't understand why there was this divide in, sort of blue versus red. And I do think some of what drove it in the early days was just, we are going to take a position that is in direct opposition to anything Donald Trump says. So when Donald Trump said, we need to open the schools in, I think, July of 2020, 2 weeks later, the American Academy of Pediatrics reversed their position. They had, before he said that, said, we need to open schools. Then he said, we need to open them. And they're like, we take it back. We take it back. I'm like, if that's not the most obvious example of this being about politics, not what's good for the community, what's good for our society, and what's good for our children, then I don't know what is. But because it was politicized in that way, I thought, well, if the Democrats take back the White House, then they'll just declare victory over COVID and everything will go away. But it didn't. It just kept getting worse and more. And I think it was in the ether at that point, and people's identities were tied to being pro-lockdowners. Like, why would you want your identity tied to that? And to your point, some of them, they still wear masks to this day to signal that they're on the good side, that they're team good. And it's now just another piece of the kind of political landscape and the dynamic that exists, you know?
That's a great point that you said about the people who made it their personality, because these were people who didn't have a personality until March 11th of 2020, is that they became the pro-lockdowners. They became the quote unquote, the Karens that I remembered hearing from TV stations that the people who work at TV stations on the switchboard were saying, I saw somebody walk into an Applebee's and I thought restaurants are supposed to be closed down. And the switchboard operator has to go, did it ever occur to you that people are probably getting DoorDash and somebody has to physically go, again, something that they didn't think about, that the food fairy shows up at you press 2 buttons on your phone, you get a cheeseburger and it just magically shows up. Well, who cooked the burger? How'd the burger, how'd the bun, how'd the condiments get to the restaurant? It's that iPencil. It's the great iPencil essay for people who ever want to go check that out. And they couldn't figure this out. And this can continue throughout 2021. There was, of course, and then the new variants popped up. And then slowly in 2022, a lot of places phased out the vaccine cards and everything. And what concerns me right now, because I think your book and other people have written, but I know Tom Woods, I believe, is coming out with a book as well about it, but chronicling this time is a cautionary tale. Yet what I feared at the time, because I'm thinking, look, I'm a podcaster, I'm a radio guy, I'm documenting this in real time, but more people need to document this because it seems to be getting memory hold. That's what I feared then, and I think it's going on now. That
I think that's right.
From my perspective, I see a lot of people going, yeah, that was a couple of years ago. Yeah, we had to lock down for a couple of weeks. We watched Netflix and we ordered margaritas to go. And it was like it was a temporary
Wasn't that a nice time that we had where we got to stay home and be together? Yeah, that seems to be, I agree with you. It does need to be documented. There's another book that's out now, which I have not read yet, by Joe Nocera, a reporter, that says basically lockdown's the big fail. I think it's called The Big Fail. I haven't read it, so I don't want to comment on how good or not good it is. But at least it's in the title that lockdowns were a big fail. But you're right. And I wrote the book with that in mind. Like I didn't care so much how well it did. I wanted to document, like from a personal perspective, not a journalistic perspective, but from the personal perspective of somebody that saw it early, spoke up, and suffered the repercussions and the cancellation of that. And I document very clearly because I was following it so closely. So I wrote it with that in mind. Like, if somebody read this artifact in 10 years to understand what happened during COVID, would it be there? And it is there. You know, I lay it all out. And I hope a lot of other people do. I think what frustrates me, and I'm sure you at this point in time, there's another book about the impact of school closures by a reporter named Anya Kamenetz. This is, an example. There seems to be widespread agreement that school closures were terribly harmful, but
they're finally starting to say it on Bill Maher's show of all places. I mean, this is like he was like the liberal Jesus for a long time in Bill Maher. And when you have people like Andrew Cuomo and that NYU professor who says, I was a harsh lockdowner for school closures, and it turns out we were wrong. Now, they don't apologize. They just say, well, we need some amnesty.
Well, okay. I mean, what I was going to say is there's acknowledgement, but there's not accountability. There's no, like, these people did it. These government officials, these public health bureaucrats who were given way too much power, made terrible decisions. They loved having that power over us, and they milked it for all it was worth. And they made poor decisions given the data that we had. And they can never have that much power and authority again. I mean, I don't want Cuomo on the Bill Maher show. He was the worst. He led the country. Well, Gavin Newsom, I believe, was the worst, but he was one of the worst. He does not get to have redemption and not get asked hard questions on Bill Maher. And Scott Galloway, the NYU professor, again, not a position of leadership or authority, but he goes on and he's like, well, maybe we were overcautious, but we should all get some grace and forgiveness. No, where's my grace and forgiveness? I was actually right. And I have received no grace and forgiveness. And I don't want to make this about me. I mean, people like me. People have lost careers. They've lost their reputations for being right. And what we're still told is, well, you may have been right, but it was for the wrong reason. So you're still a bad person. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. Whereas Scott Galloway and, you know, Emily Oster's view, Brown professor, is, well, we may have been wrong, but it was for the right reason. So we're still the good people. F that.
Yeah, I can't. When that story came out about a year ago was it Time or no, it was the Atlantic that said, how about a pandemic amnesty? And it goes through this and I know you know exactly what
Emily
I'm talking
Oster,
about.
Yeah.
It was, well, it was spring of 2020, and there was a family that was not wearing a mask while I'm like, and we were really upset because the other people weren't masking when we were going hiking. And then it says, like, turns out that there wasn't any data that COVID spreads that way through hiking and everything like that. And it's like, how about let's just bury the hatchet? And I'm like, yeah, no, we're not going to bury the hatchet. And I think I've experienced it with my career. I've had friends and colleagues they turn their back on me. They unfriended, they unfollowed, they blocked me.
Yeah.
And like, how dare you? Do you want to kill my grandmother? Don't you understand? I have a kidney issue. And it's like, yeah, okay. And to watch that in real time, and people don't know what it's like, because I think the American people are reasonable people, but they don't want to rock the boat. When you think about the colonists, that there wasn't really a lot of like radical people in the early days in the Revolutionary War that wanted to overthrow the government in England and the Parliament. And I think with the American people, we're reasonable. And if we're told, hey, or they're putting a mask mandate on Monday, most people are going to go, well, I prefer not to, but I guess that's what I got to do. I don't want to get fired. I don't want to get in trouble at work. I don't want HR talking to me. And they preyed on those people. So for the dissident voices like yours, like mine, like so many others, we had to suffer the consequences. And here we are 3 years later going, guys, how about an olive branch? No,
I don't feel like it. The one thing I will say is, I don't think it's just the American people. I think, and this is one of the things, because in the heat of it, I was like, why aren't more people saying something? But I think as I've studied this and looked across time and geographies, I think most people go along. They just do. I mean, the Milgram experiment bears it out. I think you've got 10% on either side. You know, you've got 10% who are willing to kind of stand up and, you know, suffer the slings and arrows. You got 10% that are true believers, and you've got those are the ones still masking everywhere. And then you've got sort of 80% in the middle who are like, there's a range, but I'll just go along and hope this ends soon. No, that's not me. And eventually a lot of those people will come around and they'll pretend they were always there, because everybody thinks of themselves as a hero in their own mind. But somehow that made me feel better. Like, I think that's just human nature. I don't think there's anything particularly egregious about Americans or people that did this during COVID. I think that is just true. It's just true. People just go along. Unfortunately. But somebody has to stand up and say, this is not the right thing.
Yeah. Somebody. And yeah, like you said, everybody kind of will fall in line and say, like, I was always against it. I'm like, yeah, I didn't hear you. But that's just the way things are.
Yeah, I missed that. I'm sorry. I couldn't hear you through all the yelling at me that I'm a racist. But yeah, it is. I'm not, look, I have one group we haven't mentioned that I have a special disdain for is the journalists who went along during this time, because I think journalists and the press are supposed to be a bulwark against excessive governmental power.
The arbiters of truth. Democracy dies in darkness.
Yes, they're supposed to guard us against excessive corporate greed. And yet journalists during this time, science journalists in particular, just published the CDC press releases as if they were journalism. They published Pfizer press releases as if they were journalism.
Yep.
And they failed to interrogate the issues. And I'm just like a normie. If I can look at the data, because it was all there from the beginning, I would expect that a science journalist could as well. And there are very few journalists who from the beginning push back, David Zweig being one of them, who
Alex
was really,
Berenson.
really good. Yes, those are about it.
Yeah, that really was about it, other than like podcasters and some radio guys and like more alternative media. But yeah, no, I saw it in firsthand, is working at a radio station that was a news station in the morning, and essentially going on the air with a written press release by the governor via his press secretary and the health director of the state of Ohio. We had this thing. Here's another thing that bothered me in Ohio. Our governor is Mike DeWine. And every day at 2:00, he would do a press conference that all the wine moms would call it Wine with DeWine. So while they're at their Zoom calls and they're working remotely, they put their TV on at 2:00. So our governor would tell us about the latest coronavirus statistics. Then he'd send it over to the health director to say why we need to stay home and mask up and everything, and not wear hazmat suits. And then you go back to the governor talking about what college tie that he has. Like, this one's from Oberlin College. It's located in Oberlin, Ohio. These are the colors from. I don't care, Mike. No one. It turned into a thing where it's a bunch of people would pour a glass of Chardonnay or Cab or Sauvignon Blanc, and they'd sit there next to their laptop, go like, "Oh, I'm only sipping. I'm not getting drunk at work because we're doing Wine with DeWine." And bringing up these things, actually, like just rereading your book and going through a lot of your interviews in the past to study for the interview, I started getting angry again, because this can happen again. And I don't think people realize that just because we went through this, and like I have some of my friends who go, "Okay, Tony, you were right. Over. Maybe they shouldn't have locked down, but it was years ago. Let's not keep talking about it." And I'm saying there's a possibility that this could happen again, and we need to be prepared.
Yes, I don't think, and that's what I mean by accountability, because I do believe it will happen again unless we firmly establish that in the public record, not like some rando like me writing a book, but in the public record, that this was the approach was a devastating catastrophe, and that we caused so much more harm than good, and this can never happen again. Like, that has to be part of the public record. We can never shut schools down. It is not only ineffective, and it's not only an atrocious civil rights violation, but it's a moral abomination. You cannot tell people in a free country they're not allowed to have people in their home. They're not allowed to have a protest unless it's the approved kind of protest for Black Lives Matter, but not if you're an anti-lockdown or an open school, or you can't have those protests. We would post notifications for rallies we were having on Facebook, and they would be taken down within minutes, not by human beings, but by Facebook. That's not the country we live in. We now know notable, renowned doctors who went against the mainstream were censored and kicked off.
The Great Barrington Declaration.
Yes. People risked their jobs. They lost their jobs. This cannot happen. This is not America. And so it needs to be established that not only was it an unfortunate outcome, but it was a terrible, terrible policy, and it can't happen again. The government leaders and the public health leaders, who were given way too much power by the government leaders, and they all used each other to say, "Oh, it wasn't my decision," right? Like, Newsom will say, "Well, I didn't decide, it was the local municipalities," or, "Oh, but I'm not deciding, my public health person is telling me." And the public health person says, "Well, it's not my decision, it's the governor's decision." So they're all like this.
Yeah, that's what Fauci said. I never said that they should lock down the country. I just only had some recommendations about what can happen. I'm like, come on. Okay. Well,
he knew exactly what would happen. He knew exactly.
Oh, yeah. It's funny you said accountability, because I want to sort of switch gears a little bit, because we talked about this off the air. So 2-3 years ago, you have people online, extremely online people, or a lot of like far left-wing coworkers and everything, or people who just working outside of whatever business, flooding inboxes of HR representatives by saying, one of your employees is saying that schools should be open, or one of your employees is saying that this vaccine doesn't work and is an anti-vaxxer and anti-this, this, and this. A lot of those same people, it's a weird crossover with the Venn diagram, are now experiencing their form of accountability, that they said there is no cancel culture. It's called accountability culture. And that if you get fired from your job, or you get kind of burned at the stake figuratively, that you deserve it because you are being held accountable. Well, now in the last month plus, since the attack, Hamas's attack on Israel, you are seeing a lot of very pro-Palestinian / pro-Hamas talking points that are being mainstreamed. And when you have somebody who's a pro-Palestinian on Facebook saying from the river to the sea, and then the next day they get an email that says, please come to the office and bring a box with your stuff. And they're saying, what the heck, man? Why am I getting fired just because I'm posting something socio-political or whatever? Why can't I say this? I was just speaking my mind. I was speaking my truth here. And I'm just like, welcome, friend.
Yeah, look, I don't cheer for anyone getting fired or censored. I think they should be able to go, and I honestly do. I think they should be able to march and they should be able to say those things. I do think there's a line. I think if you hit a guy over the head at a rally and he dies, that just happened in Los Angeles. That's a line, because that's violence, that's murder. Let's be clear. And I think he actually,
or if you're calling for mass genocide of an entire people, as opposed to saying, hey, I think my preschool kid should be in school right now. There's a little bit of a difference, I would say.
Or if you're, part of a student group and you chase a bunch of Jewish students into the library and they can't get out, I mean, that's false imprisonment. Like, that's force. That's not speech, that's force, and that's a crime. So there is a line. I don't think it's really a fuzzy line. I think if you want to march and say stupid shit that you don't even know what it means, you don't even know what river it is or what sea, and you want to say that shit, I think it's dumb, but you can do it. Not my side, not the side I'm on. And I do understand it's a complex situation, but it's not that complex. 1,400 people, probably more, because I am losing hope every day that any of those hostages are alive, were murdered in the most brutal manner. I don't think there's anything, complicated there. But that aside, people have lots of views on this issue. But yes, it is interesting. They're now all of a sudden finding their free speech backbone. And they're screaming about being doxxed. I'm like, the Harvard kids who signed the letter saying it was all Israel's fault are now screaming that, their names have been released. You signed a letter. No one's releasing your name. That's not being doxxed. I've always used my name in social media. And, some people who cared about what was happening would say, well, you're being doxxed. I'm like, I'm not being doxxed. It's my name. Now, I'm not psyched if people post pictures of my house, which they do. And that's crazy, but I'm not being doxxed. If you sign a letter and you're a member of a group and you say this entire thing is Israel's fault before the bodies have even been identified on October 8th, that's not doxing. So yeah, it's curious that now they're all sort of pro free speech, but I still think it's conditional. I still think if another, COVID happened tomorrow, my speech, it's just their speech they want to be permissible. Mm-hmm. They don't really believe in a culture of free speech. These are the same people who think misgendering is an aggressive act and should be a criminal act. They don't really want free speech.
Yeah,
they just want it for themselves.
And a lot of it, like we mentioned about the government-approved talking points during COVID, is that stay home, stay safe, wear a mask, wash your hands, this and this, get vaccinated, vaccines save lives, blah, blah, blah. Just the whole gambit of T-shirt slogans that you were seeing from that.
We see that now.
You have a very, I don't want to say anti-Israel or anti-Zion or anti-Semitic media, but there's a lot of, whether it's BBC, whether it's even New York Times, that is propping up these talking points that are very, anything, like I said, calls for genocide to whatever. And it's emboldening a lot of people. And then those people are posting that stuff on social media, almost not understanding that you do realize that all of your pro or anti-Jewish stuff and your boss is, chances are, could very well be Jewish and is giving you your walking papers. And you say, what the heck? Why am I getting fired? It's like, because you're calling for genocide on your Facebook page. And they say, well, this is cancel culture. It's like, again, I don't.
You made the rules. You made the rules.
I don't cheer on cancel. I would love to live in a world where if you are pro-Palestinian, you're pro-Israel, you're pro-Ukraine, you're pro-Russia, you're anti-vaccine, you're pro-vaccine, then we should all have these discussions. It's just the collective we decided in the last few years that no, dissident voices need to be shunned, and that's the problem. Is that Now we're choosing which dissident voices we're allowed to prop up and which ones need to be completely wiped off the map.
Yeah, exactly. And like it gets weird, the line, because to the point we discussed earlier, like we were billed as eugenicists and murderers and genocidal maniacs who just wanted to kill the immune compromised. And so that's why I sort of reserve space for the marchers, who I would argue, they don't even realize with the slogans they're citing that they do call for a genocide of Israelis, and often they veer into Jews. We've heard gas the Jews, we've heard clean the world with a Jewish star, a Star of David on it. Like, I don't know, it's kind of on the nose as far as I'm okay with killing all the Jews. We've now heard people saying, yeah, Hitler had the right idea. We wish he finished what he started. But again, this is speech. And so unless you cross over into actual harm and violence, I would still make the case it's permissible, because we were told you can't say those things because it's genocidal. Like, they can decide anything is genocidal. If you misgender someone, that's trans genocide, which is obviously not true. And so I'm kind of for, march in the streets. But I guess if your employer or future employer, and you don't have a job right now, sees you did that later and is like, I got a lot of employees that aren't going to be comfortable with that and they don't want to hire you. It's also different to not hire someone versus to fire them, right? So I don't know. The speech is fine, but it's crossing over into what feels like violence. We're seeing a 400% increase, I think, in anti-Semitic incidents of anti-Semitic violence. I don't know. There's like a real mob mentality happening, I think, at a lot of these rallies with the sloganeering, and they do escalate to violence because they feel so righteous. So their violence is justified.
Well, you said mob mentality. It's part of your book title, the subtitle of the book there, but Levi's Unbuttoned by Jennifer Say. It's the woke mob took my job but gave me my voice, and it's available there as well as Chalked Up. Go buy both books. I mean, these are both very important books for you. And from what I read, you were offered, because that Levi's basically had no place for you. The CEO was willing to give you a $1 million severance after 23 years with the company. And because you would have had to if you took that severance, you would have had to have an NDA, and you didn't want to do that. You wanted to be able to write a book and still say whatever you want. So how have you been? Are you, I guess, using the terms now, white-pilled? Are you white-pilled for the future?
What's that mean? I haven't heard that one. What does that mean?
So red-pilled, it's kind of like it's the Matrix thing. It's red-pilled and blue-pilled. It's not necessarily political, but it's red-pilling as you wake up and you realize that all these institutions are lying to you and everything like that. And blue-pilled are people that just go about their daily lives. Black-pilled and white-pilled. Black-pilled is everything sucks. Everything's going in the wrong direction. There is no hope in the future. We're going to be taken over, whatever. Or white-pilled, and Michael Malice has talked about this too, where he said, think if you are living in the Soviet Union in 1981, that in 1 decade from now, there will be no more Soviet Union. You would laugh. You would say that that's impossible. And that there's that white pill of, there is a possibility. I was black-pilled for a while during COVID. I'm like, there is no way that this is going to be 2 weeks to slow the spread, 15 days to flatten the curve. This is going to last way too long. But to be honest, as we were recording this in November 2023, I wouldn't have been surprised if you told me in let's say April or May of 2020 that by 2023 there will be no mandates, be no masks except for a couple of lunatics who are still doing so to virtue signal that COVID is
at the Palestine rallies mostly.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, they got to cover their face because they're afraid of COVID.
Or
but
getting fired.
I would have thought we would still be doing this 3 years later. But the white pill, even though I was black pilled, but people were white pilled and saying that there was enough lawsuits that were coming up against this. So I'll take it back to you. Are you hopeful for the future, for the near and distant future?
Yes, I choose to be white pilled. Otherwise, I don't think I could make it through the day. And I think, my being outspoken in gymnastics is sort of proof in my mind that, like, if you say it loud enough and you say it persistently enough and it's true, the world will come around. Now, that took 10 years. I kept that in my mind as I was speaking out about COVID. I was unable to beat the clock. But I don't know how you go through life any other way without being just totally depressed. So I do believe we will get to a point, it's not going to be that soon, where it is established fact that this was catastrophic as far as the response to what, at least at this point, is a mild respiratory virus. We can argue over whether it was from the beginning or not. I have thoughts on that. I'm not going to get into them. But we will get to that. We will get to that point. I was having this conversation with a friend yesterday and this morning via text. He's a family therapist, and he's been outspoken amongst his sort of cohort of child and family therapists about gender ideology and sort of gender affirming care, and transitioning very young children and saying it's not good. It's a disservice to these children. And he's getting a lot of pushback, and it's been really, really difficult. And I told him, just keep 10 years from now in your mind. You have to keep it in your mind. It will happen. It's unraveling in most European countries at this point. They're no longer, putting very young children on puberty blockers and cross hormone drugs. They're quite a bit further along than we are. They started sooner. They're 10 years out. They're 15 years out. They're seeing the harms that were done. And so just keep 10 years from now in your mind, but know that it's going to be a long, hard journey, and know that you're doing the right thing. So I am white pilled, I guess. And I'm glad you told me that term, because I believe the truth out's in the end, and I believe we get to the right answers. And there's a lot of suffering that can happen between now and then, but you have to believe that. You have to.
The last question I'll ask you, Jennifer, and I really appreciate you being on here. Please go buy her books, plural, not just the one we've been talking about, but also the earlier chalked up one. I've been let go. As someone who works in media, you lose your job, whether it's you say something on Twitter or whatever, you get thrown out, or the company is downsizing, you get let go. It's happened before. And I'll have like a radio station T-shirt that I worked at. I'm like, well, I don't need this anymore. Why would I be wearing this? So I'll ask you, do you have any Levi's in your house still? Do you still wear them?
Almost every day.
Really? So every time you put your jeans on, do you think like, this is the company that I had feuded with, they had a bad falling out? Or are you just like, these are damn good jeans?
I don't know if you wear Levi's. I've been wearing them since I was 6. I wore them almost exclusively starting in my 20s. And then certainly when I started working there at 29, I've worn them exclusively ever since. I have probably over 100 pairs. The 501 is my favorite. It's my favorite jean. It's the best jean. So I don't think about it. I wear my favorite jeans. I pretty much only wear jeans. If you work at a jeans company for a long time, you don't have a lot of other clothing. So unless I want to burn 90% of my wardrobe and then buy all new stuff, plus, they're my favorite. They're the most comfortable. They're the best. They make your butt look the best. So,
so you put them on. You're like, you just take it out of your mind that like, hey, I used to work for this company. It's just like, well, you know what? These still fit, and these still look good on me. So,
well, here's what I'll say is, I still believe in the promise of that brand. I worked at the company for a long time. I still believe in the goodness of not just the product, but the values. I think we've all, just like I believe in the promise of America, and we had a little bump in the road the last few years, but you have to still believe that we stand on and lead the world in freedom and civil rights, and we fucked up for a few years and we'll get it back. And so I still wear the brand because I still love it. I love the values that they profess to espouse, and I love the product. So
in this picture on the cover, are those Levi's, or are those have to be like off-brand just because you didn't want to get into any legalese?
No, that's all Levi's. The bottoms are 501s, the jacket, the T-shirt, all of it.
Very nice. All right. Well, Jennifer, it was a real pleasure speaking with you, and good luck not only with the book, but everything going forward. I'm glad you're white-pilled because it's tough out there, especially if you're a parent. I'm working on trying to have children myself, but I can't even imagine what parents had to go through the last couple of years, and what's going to happen going forward. But best of luck to you.
Thank you.
Dealing with this and dealing with your detractors. And it seems like it's only been a couple of years, but it seems like you really are coming out on the other side and looking pretty good.
Hope you are too. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I appreciate you folks for listening to the Check Your Brain podcast. I'll be back with you with another free episode of this fine podcast, if I do say so myself, coming up next Wednesday. Bye, everybody.